Díomh Accordia, agus fáilte Rota go Féile James Connolly. Hello, and you're all very welcome here this evening to James Connolly Festival. This festival runs all week, and you should all have been handed programmes on the way in that will have the full run of what's happening this week. Tonight, of course, we're here to discuss Ireland's housing crisis, public housing, the solution. This event takes place in partnership with Project Arts Centre and their programme of events, Clear Away the Rubble, Glán an Spáillí ar Shiúl, an open research project about housing. The consideration of housing crisis, its causes, symptoms and its possible solutions is the first of a set of annual research exhibitions. This series will test out ideas of how we can share knowledge with each other and connect with others who are working on these questions through methods including research, direct action and art. It is kicked off with a screening programme organised by Amy, which can be seen in the gallery downstairs until Saturday 14th of May. It is a collection of works by artists who are addressing these questions in diverse ways, thinking about housing activism, conditions in which people are living, ideas of home, the utopian and dystopian ideas underpinning planning and development, and the financialisation and commodification of housing. The programme will continue through May with a series of events, including presentations, public discussions, reading groups, screening events, and artist talks. My name is Orla Byrne. I'm the outgoing national representative for CATU, and I'm going to be your chair for this discussion. For those here who are not familiar with CATU, we are Community Action Tenants Union. We have over 1,600 members across the island, across private tenants, council tenants, mortgage holders, and those in precarious living situations. We take the basic union ideas of membership, collective direct action, and grassroots democracy and take them from where people work to where they live. In the last quarter of 2021, rent prices rose by an average of 10% nationwide, with some counties such as Donegal and Mayo seeing raises in excess of 20%. In March 2022, there were 9,825 people accessing emergency accommodation, 2,811 of which are children. We are in a housing crisis, and yet we are constantly being offered weak excuses by government as to why this crisis is not being addressed. When the COVID-19 crisis struck, the government found political will to enforce restrictions and mitigations to manage the virus, including an eviction ban, which was later allowed to expire, showing that it can indeed be done. When the Ukrainian refugee crisis struck, the government found political will to find housing solutions for these displaced people, despite having thousands of other refugees stuck in direct provision. And yet, in response to the housing crisis, we are left wanting, or rather, needing. In response to the current housing climate, CATU chooses to change the balance of power between tenants and landlords through organising and direct action. Tonight we are going to be hearing from our panellists on other methods and ideas for tackling the housing crisis. And we are going to begin with Dr. Rory Hearn. He is a lecturer in social policy in Maynooth University. Rory has published on the topics of housing and social housing, spatial disadvantage, housing rights, economic inequality, neoliberalism and the welfare state, social justice and social movements. He is also the author of Housing Shock, the Irish Housing Crisis and How to Solve It, and the host of the podcast Reboot Republic. So we can give a welcome to Dr. Rory Hearn.
Good. Are we going from here? Yeah. Okay. It's really weird with the lights. Just about to see you. So thank you very much for the invite to be here tonight, and I'm delighted to be part of it. The first public speaking event, I think, since COVID. It's wonderful to be out again and with people, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, to hear from our speakers tonight, and debate around housing and the crisis. And we're probably, unfortunately, all going to agree too much with each other that the real issue is how we challenge and change the housing policy that is in existence at the moment. In terms of what I want to touch, I only have 10 minutes. I could probably, as we all could, talk for hours and hours and days on what are the solutions. And in some ways, that's part of the problem, that we know the solutions to the housing crisis. They are there, government knows them, and yet they have failed over and over to implement them. And just a brief comment on the Ukraine refugee situation and what that has meant. And I am very worried about how that is being portrayed in the media, but also being manipulated by government, because even what you said there in the introduction of things being done that weren't being done before, but the only place they're actually being done is on the press releases from government. There's not actually, as far as I can see anyway, maybe Owen will know more, any real substantial radical changes in what they're doing. They're talking about doing things, and in ways that's even worse. And they're also using the Ukraine refugee crisis to somehow justify housing targets been missed, We also had the reference to, again, as far as I only saw it on headlines, but by Darragh O'Brien, the housing minister, to non-EU migrants explaining the recent rise in homelessness. And I think that is, for me, one of the real worries and concerns I have is that we are going to see a rise in racism, and this will suit those in power as refugees, and those who are already marginalised are blamed for a housing crisis that pre-existed and predated any Ukraine refugees arriving in here, but also is caused by housing policy and repeated housing policy failure. And I am just really worried about that. So I think all of us who are in solidarity with migrants, with refugees, will have to, I think, really double our efforts in the coming period of time to make the case that the housing crisis results from housing policy and not from refugees. And importantly, that we can provide homes and should provide homes for refugees and not provide temporary accommodation, which is not at all suitable. I just feel that's really important, and I said something that I'm very worried about. I think in terms of looking at where we are at with the housing crisis now, and as some of you might be familiar, we've been banging on about this for a long time. We are almost, in some respects, almost 25 years of a housing crisis. If you go back to the mid-1990s and possibly even the early 1990s, we are in a state of either boom, bust in our housing prices and rents as well, in a situation whereby housing policy has shifted away from delivering what we call public housing. And I think at its core, we have some fundamental problems in policy, and that our housing crisis will continue as long as it doesn't make the shift to delivering public housing on a major scale. And also that what we've seen, our housing system, and in particular in Dublin, but now increasingly they are heading for the regional cities of Galway, Limerick, and Cork, is the role of investment funds and the vulture funds, or vampire funds as they call them, taking over a substantial proportion of our housing system, our housing market, and turning it into these permanent build-to-rent developments at absolutely unaffordable rents, and locking out the possibility of people being able to buy homes, but also locking them into permanent affordable rentals. And just to give one example, I was in Maynooth, where I work in the university. There's a development that, again, like lots of these developments we're seeing coming up around us, people looking at them and going, great, that's new supply coming on board, 150 homes built by Cairn Homes. And what are they? All bought by a company called Urbio, which is an Irish, essentially mainly Irish-controlled real estate investment trust, backed by Starwood, which is a US global fund. And all 150 units are going to be rented out, but the rents they are at are just phenomenal and unaffordable. And at rents, it was in Maynooth, this is in Kildare, rents in the region of, 2,000 for a two-bedroom apartment. They're completely unaffordable. And someone was making the case and said, well, at least these are homes, and that's what the government is saying. Well, at least we have this supply of homes, but they're not homes. People are renting them because they have no choice. They have no alternative. And what they're sacrificing in renting them, in terms of, we know renters are in poverty, are being pushed to decide between, basic living expenses and paying their rent. And so, yes, there's, people are taking them up because they have no alternative. But what it is forcing them into is a form of, permanent, rental exploitation. And it is just, I think this is not a solution. And I think we're getting closer to what I described in my book, was a housing dystopia, that I think we're still, at a potential point where we can turn this around. And of course, we can always turn it around by making very, radical and different decisions. But the investor funds are still, they are planning to build, tens of thousands more. We can still change that. And But I think where we are heading down the road, if we look again, homelessness rising again, we look at house prices, the question, are we in another bubble of house prices? Are they going to fall again? And it does come back to, I think, that question of our housing policy and our housing system and who has it been run for, who is it being run for? And for me, it is back to values. And when we look at it, we see that our housing system in Ireland has never treated housing as a human right. And I think that's a fundamental flaw. Over the last 30 years, we've shifted to a marketized, financialized housing system where the market has become the dominant provider of housing, the dominant decider of housing. And increasingly then over the last kind of 8 years, investment funds, global real estate funds have become the key influential decider of whether housing is supplied or not. And we see the massive inequalities that are there, and just some of them, that people, come to me as I know they are to politicians and tell me about their housing situations, and I cover them in my podcast and try and give people a place to talk about them, and they are utterly heartbreaking. They are really just, at some levels I don't understand how we aren't, rioting on the streets in terms of what is going on, what is being done to people. And I know it's a complicated reason for why there aren't major protests and we've had COVID, but just some of the human impacts, like I was dealing with a case the last couple of weeks where a mother and her son are in a private rental, but their rent is contributed by the local council, by the rental accommodation scheme, the RAS scheme. But their landlord, like lots of landlords, is selling up, wants to take advantage of the rising property prices. She works in the public sector, a very, a good job, a very important job for our state. And yet she is on the brink, her and her son are on the brink of homelessness and are likely probably not to go into emergency accommodation, but likely to go into hidden homelessness. They're likely probably to couch surf. And this is what's happening to thousands of families and individuals right now across this country. And if we look at the notices to quit that are been served in last year, we were close to 3,500 notices to quit were served to tenants. That's essentially eviction notice. Not 90% of them, not the tenant's fault. And I put this figure out there, and I'd love any historian here. I think that's the highest number of evictions since the foundation of the state that is happening in this country, and possibly since the famine. That is where we are at, and that is the scale of the crisis. And the deepest, disturbing aspect of this is that government knows it's happening. It knows the cost, the human devastating cost to individuals, to families, and yet it makes the argument over and over that, well, we need supply, and if we take action like banning evictions, then, it will deter the supply we need. And they have become utterly beholden and captured to the market, and in particular to the large investment funds. And that is why we're seeing this, humanitarian catastrophe that isn't just affecting those homeless. It's affecting people, the 350,000 adults who are living at home in parents' box rooms, whose mental health is being destroyed, whose life dreams are just, being literally fading away in front of them. And we also then have emigration. We have now young people and not so young people emigrating for the first time in our history, not because they can't get a job, but because they can't get a home. And it is an utter disgrace. And it angers me and upsets me that we are losing people who are committed to this country, who've so much to give. I was talking to one person who's an economist, and they're going, no, I'm leaving, that's it. I just don't see a future here. And thinking of what they have, and every person who emigrates, who leaves us, that what they have to offer in our loss. And I think of my own children, and I know other people think of their children and going, what sort of future are we creating in this country? And for me, what it shows is the centrality of home, of housing, and that if your country doesn't provide a home and housing for its people and a notional republic, then it's not a republic at all in any sense of the meaning of the word. So I think we need, and I'm conscious of my time, I think we need a radical transformation in our housing policy. We need a right to housing set out by the UN, which includes, it's well worth people, if they're not familiar with it, look it up. It has 7 key aspects to it, which include affordability. Housing should be affordable. It should have security of tenure. It should be habitable, which means it shouldn't have mold or damp, which is a major problem as well we have in our public and private rental housing. It should be culturally appropriate, which means, of course, for traveller housing, and also it should be accessible, which means in terms of disabled people and having accessible housing, because we've multiple hidden homeless and hidden housing crises within our crisis of housing. But I think that we need this value shift, and I think that we need an equality movement for housing, like we saw on marriage equality and repeal. And I think this one, we need a movement that is around the heart and home being central, and that everybody has the right to have a secure, affordable, decent standard home, and the government has an obligation to deliver that, and at its heart is public housing, social housing, affordable housing for sale, affordable for rent, and supporting the likes of the O'Coulon Cooperative, developing cooperatives. But it does mean the state investing in housing. It's claiming at the moment that it's investing unprecedented amounts, but that's also because we have the highest population since the foundation of the state. So of course you're spending more than you did before. But in terms of, we look at the 4 billion being spent, it's still inadequate. It's absolutely inadequate to overcome the deficit of that what hasn't been built, to overcome our crisis, and I think to really provide a non-commodified, non-market form of affordable housing. And I don't see any reason why the state shouldn't be building affordable housing for sale on a major scale, and it should put in place measures. I think that housing is kept in a form of an affordable market into perpetuity, and you can do that in lots of different ways so it doesn't become commodified down the line. But it should be, and it needs to be, I think, on a scale that we haven't seen before. So, and the other key thing in terms of the right to housing is the referendum. We need a referendum, I think, to put a right to housing in the Constitution as part of that movement. But hopefully there are some thoughts and reflections that, yes, hopefully the change we need is so great. I think that's really our challenge. So, there we go. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Great. We're going to go now to Owen O'Byrne. Owen is Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Mid-West and the party's spokesperson for housing, local government and heritage. He's the author of several books, including Home, Why Public Housing is the Answer, and Defects, Living with the Legacy of the Celtic Tiger. So let's go on.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you here this evening. At the start of these talks, one of the things I always say is it's important that we don't end up just depressing ourselves with how bad the situation is, and I don't say that in a glib way, but anybody in this room who is working on the front line with people in acute housing need or who's experiencing that need themselves will know what I'm talking about. But we also need to know where things are going, how bad things are likely to get, the reasons why they're that way. But crucially, as Rory outlined at the end, and I'm going to try and do as well, we have to come out of these meetings, first of all, with a sense of hope that things can change, and with a sense of, well, what is it that we're going to do collectively to achieve that change. So in the few minutes I have, I just want to maybe get the negative, depressing stuff out of the way first, and then talk about the hopeful, positive stuff in the second half. The housing crisis that we've been experiencing, particularly at its most acute end since 2014, is getting worse and is going to get worse in the time ahead. There's just no other way of looking at it. Since Darragh O'Brien ended the ban on evictions, we have seen the numbers of adults and children officially recognised as homeless increase almost month on month. We've had 9 straight months of upward trend, and we are perilously close to that symbolic 10,000 number. Now, the actual number of adults and children in emergency accommodation and homeless is far greater than that official target. It's somewhere around 14,000 when you add in the women and children and TUSLA domestic violence refuges. adults and children who are in refuges not funded by the state. And that's before we talk about folks trapped in direct provision, despite the fact that they have their leave to remain. There's about 2,000 of those. About half of those have been in that situation for over a year, as well as the hidden homeless. So the problem is much bigger, but there is that kind of symbolic 10,000 figure that we thought we would never reach before, and we're probably a month or 2 months away from reaching that figure again. And the reason, of course, is because the social housing output, modest and all as the targets have been, isn't been met. Last year, government was meant to deliver 9,500 new build social homes. They only got about 5,202, so they were short by about 45%. It was a similar figure the year before. But also something we're not talking enough about is the private rental sector is shrinking. Whatever one thinks about the private rental sector or landlords, because of government housing policy for decades, huge numbers of people, particularly large numbers of people who should be in social housing, are living in the private rental sector, likewise with students and other vulnerable and marginalised groups. And because house prices are so high, single property landlords, particularly your accidental and semi-professionals, are leaving in droves. And that means every single month the number of properties available to rent is shrinking, and is shrinking dramatically. Rents are going up, house prices are going up, and the government's affordable housing delivery has been almost non-existent. Not a single affordable home to purchase has been delivered by any government since the crash, and the first round of affordable rentals, or cost rentals as they're called, was delivered last year, 65 units, but again there's a question in terms of the level of affordability. So what that means is whether you're somebody at risk of or experiencing homelessness, whether you're somebody languishing on a local authority housing waiting list, whether you're somebody not eligible for social housing, looking to rent or to buy, things are bad and only going in one direction under the current government's policies. And all of that was before we had the war in Ukraine and the refugee crisis here. And I want to be very clear, and Rory wrote a very important piece in the Examiner a couple of weeks ago, and it is a point we have to keep repeating over and over again. While the housing crisis was bad before the refugee crisis, it is now worse. But it is possible to meet the needs of all sections of our society, including those Ukrainians who won't have homes to go back to at the end of this war and will end up staying in Ireland and looking for permanent accommodation, and we can come back to that. So if we're going to kind of put in place adequate solutions, we have to have at least a grip of the problem, and I suspect almost everybody who's come here knows what the problem is, so I'm not going to labour it, but really there are two key elements to the problem underlying our housing crisis that have been government policy for 30 or 40 years. The first is an over-reliance on the private market, particularly large developers, large investors and other players to meet all sections of housing need. And the flip side is a dramatic under-provision in public housing, non-market housing, social and affordable housing, whatever terminology that you want to use. And in fact, despite the fact that the government says they're spending €4 billion annually on public housing, that's not true. If you actually look at the budget estimates that are announced each October, the actual allocation for public housing, so direct delivery of social and affordable housing by local authorities and approved housing bodies, is this year just under €1.5 billion. That's less than 100 million more than the year before, a tiny increase. And in fact, the social housing budget for this year has actually decreased. It's a cut on last year, but we can get into that detail. And really what's been happening here, I think, is encapsulated in a wonderful phrase by a great English housing rights activist and writer, Anna Minton, a shift from bricks to benefit, that the role of the state is not in the delivery of large volumes of non-market public housing, but it's in subsidising private sector, private landlords, private developers, private investors to deliver housing of various kinds, including through the growing number of people, for example, in the private rental sector, on HAP-RAS or rent supplement. About a third of all private rental tenancies, the 300,000 private rental tenancies, are folks who should be and want to be in social housing but are being subsidised by the taxpayer in private rental, and that bill is going to continue to grow in the time ahead. The last government's housing plan, Rebuilding Ireland, met almost all of its targets. Don't let anybody tell you it didn't, bar the macro target of private sector output, but actually almost all of its public housing targets it met, and things got worse. And the reason is because the targets were too low, and most of us, myself, Rory, many other housing campaigners, academics and policy experts made that point when it was launched. And the problem is the new housing plan and I absolutely refuse to use it by its name, because if we use the name that the government has given to it, it's almost conceding the fact that it's going to do what it says it's doing. It is the government's housing plan rather than its ill-titled document. But in fact, the only new things that Darragh O'Brien has added into that plan are going to make it worse. This shared equity loan that probably is going to be available, albeit on a much smaller level than originally planned in Q2 of this year, is going to push up house prices. The extension of the Help to Buy, another scheme that has an appalling name, again is going to inflate house prices further. You will have seen last week the leaking on Friday in the front page of the Irish Independent of the Connolly Cities programme, an enormous subsidy, up to €120,000 per unit of accommodation for developers. And apparently, according to the briefing from whoever in the department, there won't even be a reduction in the price to the purchaser of the property. Never before have I heard of such an absurd subsidy. And even the things that the government is doing, which those of us in the opposition are critically supporting, like the Affordable Housing Fund to local authorities and the cost rental equity loan to approved housing bodies, they're not even getting that right. They can't even take a perfectly good idea and implement it here in a way that actually does what it says on the tin. So if that is the core problem, over-reliance on the market, under-provision of non-market public housing, then exactly as Rory said, public housing is the answer. And we just can't repeat this over and over again. And I've been using a phrase over the last couple of weeks, particularly in light of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which kind of goes something like this. We desperately need a new housing plan, but we need a plan that can meet the needs of everybody, from the homeless to the refugees to everybody in between. A housing plan that leaves no person or no family behind. And I think the more we repeat that phrase, the more we're able to avoid anybody attempting from the right to pit one group of people in acute housing need against the other and trying to unite all sections of society that are negatively impacted by these housing policies. There's a couple of emergency measures and we need them pretty quickly. We need a ban on rent increases in the private rental sector. It doesn't have to be indefinite. 3 to 4 years would probably do it if we were to do all of the other things I'm going to list out now and that Rory has spoken about already. But that ban is key. But it's not enough, because if you're paying rent at the top end of the market, you also need a rent reduction, and different opposition parties have different proposals, but we also have to put money back in renters' pockets. And we can talk about the detail of that if people are interested. We also need to introduce tenancies of indefinite duration. One of the most dishonest things Darragh O'Brien did last year was make a tiny technical amendment to the Residential Tenancies Act, claiming he was introducing tenancies of indefinite duration, when of course, as Rory said, the vast majority of notices to quit are no-fault evictions, sale of property, use by landlord or landlord family member, substantial refurbishment, etc. And therefore, tenancies of indefinite duration means what it says on the tin. You get to stay in the property unless you stop paying your rent for no good reason. You trash the property, engage in very serious criminal activity. And on the homeless front, in order to stop the dramatic escalation in homeless presentations and adults and children going into emergency accommodation, there's 2 pieces of legislation: the Focus Ireland Amendment, which government has yet to accept, that needs to be introduced. The Salmon Communities Homeless Prevention Bill, which was passed without government opposition last December, needs to be enacted. And a far greater focus needs to be on homeless prevention, preventing people from being evicted, whether from the private rental sector or elsewhere, and ending up in emergency accommodation or worse on the streets. And those are things we have to do as quickly as possible. But then on the broader side, we need to have a public housing delivery programme, the scale of which the state has never seen. Government's housing plan says we need about 33,000 new homes a year. That is a chronic underestimation, and that was before Ukraine. My estimation is we probably need about 40,000, and that now needs to be revised upwards. The census will give us good data for that. But let's take that figure of 40,000. Of that, a minimum of half of all of that housing has to be non-market public housing to meet a variety of forms of social and affordable housing need. Delivered by local authorities, approved housing bodies, community housing trusts. Rory and others have other suggestions. But the crucial thing is we have to dramatically scale up the delivery of those non-market homes. At the moment, about 9% of our housing system, our housing stock, is non-market or non-private. We need to get to at least 30% at a minimum to stabilise the housing system and be able to meet people's needs into the future. For Sinn Féin, that is a mixture of social affordable cost rental and affordable purchase, but we have a very different proposition around leasehold purchase to prevent those properties ever being sold into the private market. You'd almost like build up this sub-market of privately owned, privately tradable, but permanently affordable homes for those people whose preference is to buy. And again, there's more details on that. And the best way to do that, particularly in the era of climate change and the need for altering many of our living patterns, is in greater volumes of mid-rise, mixed-use, mixed-income communities, particularly in our urban centres, our cities and towns. And in the countryside, a greater use of clustering, of hamlets and of sensible kind of planning designs. We also have to ensure that as we build those homes, we move towards zero carbon housing. Over 30% of the total emissions into carbon emissions in the state at the moment are from the built environment. About 20% are from operational emissions, that's the energy inefficiencies of the buildings we use. And about 10% is the embodied carbon in the new homes. Retrofitting and the higher energy efficiency standards of new homes will reduce a lot of that operational. But if we are going to build 40,000 new homes a year, we can't be building them all new, and we can't be building them all from concrete, brick and steel. And that's why the 90,000 plus vacant homes out there are such an opportunity. Not only would they revitalise our city centres, town centres and our villages, but they are in many cases cheaper and quicker to get back into the housing stock, and they have virtually zero carbon or much lower levels of carbon. But it also means we need to be embracing new technologies. You go to Scandinavia, you go to Poland, you go to France. We're seeing some incredible building technologies. The Guardian newspaper, Monday of last week, had this great article. I'd urge you to go back and have a look at it online. But this great housing co-op in Barcelona, La Borda is its name. And not only is it a wonderful building, 26 odd apartments, with great communal spaces, communally managed and run, but it has incredible energy efficiency, and the embodied carbon in the buildings themselves is so low it's near zero, and it's 35% cheaper than any comparable private sector product that's out there through a community housing trust in Barcelona. And that's the kind of model that we need to move to into the future. We also need to have a conversation about the maintenance of our housing stock. Rory, for many years, worked in some of the poorest maintained housing stock in our inner cities. And it's not just old stock, some of it was built during the Celtic Tiger, and that has to be part of our conversation. But also, we have to ensure that tenants, particularly tenants in lower income communities, are empowered and mobilised to become decision makers in the communities in which they live. That public housing isn't a top-down kind of patrimonial gift by the state, but actually it's a mechanism by which we can empower those communities to improve the quality of their lives and the people around them. And crucially, and I want to emphasise this point that Rory made, as we do all of that, we have to make sure that those people in our society who have always been left behind, and in particular those with disabilities, travellers and minority ethnic groups, are at the centre of all of our housing plans. What we cannot have is a situation where we ramp up the overall output of good quality public housing, but those people who have always been excluded continue to do so. So just to conclude then, the issue is, so how do we make this happen? And the straight answer is we know how to make stuff happen, because whether it was right to water, whether it was exactly as Rory said, marriage equality or repeal, two things are required. We need to build a movement where progressive politicians, I don't care from what party or from no party, but progressive politicians in councils and in the Oireachtas, cooperate and work with a critical mass of activists on the ground in individual campaign organisations and local community groups, but also through what was before COVID emerging as a bit of an umbrella for all of that energy that raised the roof movement, to put so much pressure on whoever is in government that they either change policy or the next time there's an election, the government is changed and politicians who are elected from whatever party who are going to implement those policies. We were at the very early stages of that, and again, myself and Rory and others were very involved before COVID, and Raise the Roof was just beginning to get off the ground when COVID hit. But what's significant about Raise the Roof is, unlike Right to Water, it has the entire trade union movement behind it. With Right to Water, we only had the anti-austerity trade unions. It has the entire political opposition. And while we can agree and disagree on tactics and policy detail, the maximum level of unity is absolutely key here. And it also had widespread public support. What we're experiencing in society at the moment is such a wide degree of housing need and dissatisfaction with the failures of decades of failed Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael-led government housing policy, that actually the potential to mobilise an even bigger group of people than those three mass movements of recent times is there. COVID is now receding. Raise the Roof, for people's information, will be relaunching in about a week or two, both outlining its critique of the current government's housing plan, its support for the kind of approach to the Ukrainian refugee crisis that Rory outlined, and at the start a series of town hall events around the country to start bringing people back together in meetings like this, hearing what those people at the hard edge of the housing crisis have to say, and mobilising people ultimately towards, of course, a major demonstration in the centre of Dublin as just the start of a campaign which hopefully will start to lift the profile of this issue on the streets, which is the one thing that has been lacking in recent times, to ensure that no party in any government can continue to do the kinds of things that both this and the previous government have been doing in policy. So I commend this initiative. I think it's really great. I would urge all of you who are passionate and affected by this, get involved if you're not already involved in whatever way you can. No one organisation can sort this. No one campaign group has the solutions. We all have a part to play, but it's that critical mass, that mass mobilisation of people power and progressive elected politicians that can make the difference here, and that's what we need to see in the days, weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Owen. Jimmy Doran's up next. Jimmy is a sitting member on the National Executive of the Communist Party of Ireland and a regular contributor to the party's magazine, The Socialist Voice. Jimmy is a lifelong trade unionist also. Jimmy was a leading figure in the formation of the Campaign for Public Housing Group and writes regularly on the question of housing. You can go ahead.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you. So this isn't the first time the state was faced with a housing catastrophe. We had a housing catastrophe back in the 30s when tenements were falling down around the people here in Dublin. And in the 1930s up to the 50s, 55% of housing was built by the state. In 1961 it peaked, where 18.6% of all citizens lived in a publicly owned home. Last year the government aimed to build 33,000 homes. Not the government, they aimed to get 33,000 homes built. They didn't. They only managed to get 20,443, and of these a mere 1,198 were built by local authorities. Property ownership is key to the housing crisis. Who owns it, controls it, the price, the rent, the type, the size, where it is, the number of them that are available. In the early days of the state, Fianna Fáil still held some revolutionary ambitions. Hundreds of thousands of publicly owned homes were built for the citizens of the state. These homes provided shelter for our citizens and managed to eradicate the squalor left by the British in the forms of slums and tenements in our cities and towns. Mistakes were made, of course. Some of the housing estates were built without any facilities for the residents, without shops, schools, transport, etc. But many of these homes were of high quality, and tens of thousands of families have been reared in local authority homes for decades. What they may have lacked in facilities, they made up with the communities that developed in them. The major mistake that was made was the income limit that was put in place in order to qualify for a council house. This building of public housing by the state did not happen by accident or out of the kindness of the state's heart. The state was forced to, as the tenements were overcrowded and in a desperate state affecting the health of the residents, and they were literally collapsing and killing people on a regular basis. We had the worst slums in Europe. So the state was forced to act, and like all capitalist governments, when faced with an emergency, they adopt socialist models to solve the crisis. So they made a decision to build and provide homes for the citizens for differential rent and end the squalor left by the British. Of course, they had one eye on the ballot box, as always, and building public housing did them no harm when it came around to election time. The property class and the church had different ideas. This could not be allowed to happen in the land of saints and scholars, Holy Catholic Ireland, or capitalist Ireland. So the lackeys of the protectors of capital spoke up. In 1952, Labour Party Senator James Tunney said, "I'm a firm believer in private ownership because it makes for better citizens, and there is no greater barrier against communism." In 1967, Archbishop Lucy of Cork told De Valera that public housing was akin to Bolshevism, and property-owning citizenry would make a more compliant and obedient citizen. It's ironic that there's a park named after Archbishop Lucy down in Cork now, and it is providing homes for people in the form of tents. So that's what Archbishop Lucy contributed to the housing crisis in Ireland. So De Valera started selling off council houses to tenants at knockdown prices 20 years before Thatcher did it in Britain. They were sold at a fraction of their worth and a fraction of what they cost to build. Those who did not want to buy their council homes were offered a lump sum as a bounty to move out of the council home. The sale to the tenants denied all these homes for use for future generations of citizens. The lump sums offered to tenants to move out of their homes brought the building of new homes to a trickle as existing homes were recirculated prematurely to those on the waiting list. This was the beginning of the end for public housing and marked the start of the commodification of the provision of homes for citizens, and it being transferred to the private sector in a direct transfer of wealth using working class as a vehicle via loans and mortgages to the property class. As I've said, ownership is key, so who owned the properties now? The citizens, if only. Who owned the property now was banks. So, saddled with a 30 or 40-year mortgage, the citizens became very compliant and a few short years after the revolutionary period. This created an income stream for the banks, builders and speculators, the capitalist class, that was denied to them by public housing. These new homeowners, and I say that in inverted commas, were not willing to take any chances, kept their heads down and worked away diligently now that the mortgage had to be paid every month. This still did not satisfy the capitalist class, as once mortgages began to be paid off 30 or 40 years later, the income stream from mortgage repayments would have ceased or slowed down to a trickle. A trickle down might be okay, but the capitalist class always want a flood up of wealth. Something had to be done to open this income stream again for the provision of homes. This is why the state, in tandem with selling homes back to tenants, withdrew from building public housing from the 1970s on, opening the door to the commodification of homes and transferring the provision of homes for citizens to the private sector. We can see from the census of 2016 that this led to a situation that we find ourselves in now, that private rented accommodation is now the main form of tenure in our cities and towns, as workers are priced out of the market. With the insatiable greed of the property classes pushing rents always up, we've come full circle, as the 2016 census also found that overcrowding has increased for the first time in over 50 years. So well done, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, and anybody else who props them up. They brought us full circle back to what the British left us 100 years ago. There is, of course, no housing crisis for the ruling class. The housing crisis is for the citizen. The crisis is the housing policy which causes all of these other symptoms, be it high rents, homelessness, overcrowding, squalor or despair. This is the government housing policy. It's working very well for those who it was designed to benefit: landlords, builders, banks, developers, speculators, the business class, the best little country in the world to do business in. It is not caused, as some would lead us to believe, by either cronyism or corruption. The system isn't broken. This is the way it was designed. It's called capitalism. A crisis will not be cured by treating the symptom. The root cause, the political strategy of the government to transfer the provision of homes to the private sector, is the problem that has to be tackled if we're going to solve the housing crisis permanently. The class issue is always ownership. This requires an emergency building campaign by the state of publicly owned housing, as was done from the 1930s to the 1970s. It must be universally accessible for rents linked to income. We need a new public housing service similar to health, transport, education on an all-Ireland basis. The housing crisis is used by many politicians to get elected. They're not necessarily trying to solve the problem. Some, of course, are, but others have absolutely no intention of solving it. And we can see this because it hasn't been solved over the last 10 years. In fact, it's getting worse. So they only use, Owen was saying there about he wouldn't name Darragh O'Brien's Housing for All policy. This is just a strategy to get elected. They're telling you that they're going to give housing for all. They're not. They have no intentions of. At the start of Chapter 4 of Labour in Irish history, James Connolly quotes the secret manifesto of the protectors of the United Irish Society of 1791 by saying, "When the aristocracy come forward, the people fall backwards. When the people come forward, the aristocracy, fearful of being left behind, insinuate themselves into our ranks and rise into timid leaders of treacherous auxiliaries." That statement is as relevant today as it was in 1791. Their methods may have changed slightly and they don't insinuate themselves into the ranks of the working class, but they've convinced their lackeys to do it for them, to confuse, distract and to water down demands. For example, cost rental model for public housing, whereby the tenant pays the full cost of building and maintaining the home over a 30-year period, even up to and including the provision of a sink fund that would provide for any unplanned costs like a new roof or rewiring or plumbing or whatever. And this without ever actually owning the property. And for rents, about 25% less than the exorbitant rack rents demanded. And if you can't afford them, the state will subsidise them, thus using the low-paid worker as a vehicle to transfer the wealth via subsidies from them back to the property classes, who in many cases are one and the same as those paying the poverty wages to workers, which makes rents unaffordable. There is no crisis that capitalism cannot solve so long as the working class are willing to pay for it. Cost rental model is a blank cheque for property developers, bankers and landlords. And employers who are let totally off the hook, again, no contribution from the profits created by employees towards the provision of homes, as the workers, their employees, pay for them in their entirety themselves, while never actually owning the property at the end of their lives. No, ownership remains in private hands, in the corporation, and possibly the same corporation that employs the worker in the factory or wherever. Another transfer of wealth and power from workers to landlord, banker and developer, aka the ruling class. The key to this is that the state believes the contribution workers make through their PAYE is enough of a contribution from the business class to society. Hence, low taxation on employers and business. We in the Communist Party continuously call for income-linked differential rents and for the state to be the builder and provider of homes for citizens. Ownership is always the class issue. Whoever owns the home controls the cost, the rent, the availability, the design, where it is, and that is what the market considers a suitable home for the working class. Pray tell, we can't let them get above their station. Once the state owns this property, the private sector is excluded and denied access to the massive income stream and power attained through the provision of shelter. We must break with the idea of property and land ownership entirely and make it all rental. Differential rents in Ireland are 15% of income. Today, some people spend as much as and more than 70% of their income on rent with no security of tenure. They can be evicted at the whim of the landlord. As this money is denied to the economy, goes straight into the pockets of the elites. Others spend 40 years scrimping and saving to pay off a mortgage on a home that they will only ever own for a couple of years before they die. This money goes directly to the property classes, also through banks and loans, etc. We need to reverse the selling of public housing to tenants. A key strand to public housing would be the purchasing by the state from particularly older people and people nearer retirement of the family home and allowing them to live in it until they depart this life. This will end pension poverty for many people and also add to the public housing stock of the state. With a state-owned construction company, building workers will have well-paid union jobs and continuity of work, an end to the boom and bust in the construction sector, unemployment and the emigrant ship. With the state building enough homes to house the people on an annual basis, property prices will stabilise and fall. The private rented accommodation used by landlords to suck the blood from citizens through excessive rents will now be worth only a fraction of the previous value. The state should have no hesitation in buying them up for knockdown prices and add them to the public stock. What goes around comes around. With differential rents, citizens are freed from the burden of massive debt and or of excessive rents at the behest of landlords and banks. With more disposable income, in the citizens' pockets as a result of reduced rents, this in turn puts more money into the local economy, providing more jobs and security for society as a whole. This is the ultimate transformative demand which can free the citizen from the burden of poverty and insecurity of shelter and be a foundation stone to end inequality and poverty. Societal well-being and health will improve with the burden of debt, uncertainty and unaffordable rents a thing of the past. As free time grows, quality of life improve and emboldened workers can reach their full potential and achieve new goals only ever dreamed of in the past. We can only imagine what the true cost of poverty is on the people of Ireland. The person with the potential cure for cancer may be living in poverty, underpaid, undervalued, exhausted and destitute at the hands of the greedy landlord or the exploitative employer, never getting a chance to reach their full potential. There is one clear, proven solution to end housing crisis, and that is the state building public housing. Can it be done? Well, in 2006, 93,419 homes were built in Ireland. The narrative has been created by the state, backed up by the media, that there is a shortage of construction workers. There's no shortage of construction workers, but they are building for the needs of capital, not society. Most of them are building hotels, data centres and office blocks, which should not be the priority in the middle of a housing emergency. There is a housing emergency caused by the government housing policy. In times of emergency, the state needs to act. It's ironic that any time there is an economic or social emergency, socialist policies are enacted by the government. Whether nationalising the banks in 2008 or taking over the private hospitals during the pandemic, or building poor public housing from the 1930s to 1970. The problem is that the capital class only ever do this as a temporary measure, a short-term compromise with the working class. Who here would complain if we keep the Beacon Hospital, AIB Bank, or council homes in public ownership for perpetuity, a state asset to benefit society as a whole? Instead of socialising debt and subsidising landlords, it is time to nationalise the building of homes with a state-owned construction company to build and maintain universally accessible public housing for the common good. For that matter, why stop at housing? There is certainly a case to nationalise all industry and start building an economy for the common good and not for the leeches of society.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was very interesting. Lots of points raised there. So we're about to throw it over to audience for questions, but I want to check if any of you have any questions for each other first. No?
Much more interested to hear the audience.
Fair enough.
We've been withering on here for far too long.
That's grand, no worries. We'll throw it over to the audience. So I can't see anyone, so...
It has to be welcomed. Getting back on the grassroots, on the actual ground, because what we have witnessed in there, I say it again, is it has to be welcomed. Coming back to the movement on the ground and doing the Paulo Freire method style with the trade union movement. If they can do us in the elections on Stormont on Friday, we can do it. On all Ireland right to housing, with working class empowerment. What we have seen and witnessed since 2018, 2016, it's obscene. And we all hear the individual stories. Let's raise that roof. We can bloody do it.
Hear, hear.
Sorry, just to jump in for 2 seconds here as well, we are passing around a bucket for donations. This festival is free, so we rely entirely on donations. So if you have some change, throw it in there. Thanks so much. I'm sorry, I'll leave you to your question.
Do you want to take a few or?
Yeah, sure. Will we take another one? Yeah. Sorry.
I just wanted to maybe direct this to Owen O'Brien. I'm just wondering, and I wouldn't say when, I don't want to say if, because I hope it happens soon. When you become housing minister, what will be your first priority?
No pressure.
We might take one more then. Yeah.
You talked about a government-owned construction company. I was just wondering, is that part of Sinn Féin's plan as well, if someday they ended up in government, and would it be a red line issue when you have to come and meet halfway for a coalition government with another party?
So they're all for me, are they?
I think so.
I mean, first of all, just to agree with Con, but also to remind people that there has been lots of good grassroots activism that's been going on despite COVID. And I just want to give a shout out to one really great initiative. Some of you might have seen the apology when it was broadcast there recently. And if you haven't come across that project, please link it with it. It's really incredible. It might even be appearing in the festival over the week, I don't know or not. But that's just another example of people, even within the confines of COVID, doing some really, really good stuff. Just on the question of government, people need to be very clear. Nothing is inevitable in the next general election, folks. Right? And I don't even mean whether Sinn Féin becomes the largest party or whether we lead a government or take the housing ministry. The only way any of us who are committed to change, whatever your particular version of change is, the only way we can ensure that happens is going out and making it happen. So I'm not taking anything for granted. To answer the question directly, there's a couple of immediate things that have to be done. We have to set that date for the referendum to enshrine the right to housing into the Constitution. It's absolutely crucial. We have to double, at a minimum, double direct capital investment in the delivery of those non-market public housing, so we get up to that at least 20,000 public homes a year. But there's a whole sub-range of things to make that happen. So I try to give a flavour of the kind of key priorities. But the crucial point to me is, if you look at housing systems all across the world, those that are the more equal, the most equitable, that were able to withstand the shock of the economic recession of 2008, were housing systems where at least 30% were non-market public housing. Some countries have a local authority municipal-led model like we used to have here in the head of Britain. Other countries have a not-for-profit AHB model. Some have a community housing trust or community land trust model. I'm not really too fussed so long as it's non-market housing, but that is going to require a level of direct state investment, which is absolutely crucial, and that would be 3 billion upwards. And then on construction, so a couple of things. First of all, two key bits of our housing policy. We'd like to see local authorities return to a direct build. And the best way probably to start doing that is to pick a couple of local authorities like, say, Cork City, and start getting them to build up their capacity. But that's going to take you some time. And meanwhile, we have a lot of houses to build. So I've no difficulty at all using small and medium-sized builders, not private developers, but small and medium-sized building contractors. They charge a small return. It's 4, 5 or 6%, nowhere near the 15% plus that the big investors or developers charge. Because we're going to need those SME companies to build the social affordable homes that they're currently building in many, many places. That's not joint ventures, that's not O'Devany Garden style partnerships, but it is using private building contractors. Many of them are local men and women who need labour, who need wages, and will spend it in the local economy. The other thing is, there was a really great initiative instituted by Cork County Council. A lot of people don't know it, which is why I want to mention it, called HISCO. They noticed down in Cork private housing providers and folks building some offices and other facilities. They couldn't get the projects off the ground because they had no infrastructure funding, and the banks were charging about 11, 12, 13% for the infrastructure. So Cork County Council came up with this brilliant idea, which is they set up a publicly owned company funded through the Strategic Investment Fund. And what they do is they step in, they provide the infrastructure, but they charge for it, right? They charge a 3 or 4% return. So they do it up front. The developers then build out their houses or build out whatever the private projects are, and then as they're selling those on, they pay back HISCO. And you can unlock developments in ways and get a return for the taxpayer, which can be recycled then into other public housing building projects. I've argued for a couple of years that Dublin City in particular, because as we move into more public apartment building, and that's where the city is going to go in the time ahead, it's only a small number of very, very large private developers like Bartra, etc., or some of the large private building contractors who are tendering for that work, and they're gouging. They're charging the most extortionate prices just for construction, right? Because all they're doing is building on public land. And therefore, I'd like to see a HISCO-type model in Dublin City, which would be owned by Dublin City Council, that would put manners on the private building contractors because it would tender for some of those jobs as well. So for me, it's a mixture of direct build, publicly owned contractors operating in the market, either to provide services or to do buildings themselves. And then we need to kind of change public procurement rules to generate greater levels of competition, so the same small number of very, very large contractors who specialise in certain kinds of projects aren't soaking up all the work and soaking up huge amounts of profit increases. And then separately to that, we would end the joint ventures and the public-private partnerships because they're just extortionately expensive and they don't provide the kind of quality and value for money that the direct public housing provision did in the past and could again into the future. Would it be a condition of coalition? Sorry. For me, the key thing is the amount of public investment. For me, one of the red lines would has to be 3 billion plus. Yeah. But can I say this, and sorry for hogging the floor, it is important to look at what the state is actually paying for social housing at the moment, right? There's about 8 or 9 different delivery streams for social housing, right? Through the direct delivery, through turnkeys, through Part 5s, and a bunch of others. The most cost effective is when a local authority is the developer on its own land, planning permission approved by the elected members. A private building contractor, an SME builder is brought in, right? But they're still delivering really, really high quality homes, all in, not just the hard, but the soft costs, from 180 to 220,000 euros. I'll take that all day long, right? The value of direct labour is you shorten the delivery times because you don't have to go out to tender with the private sector, and you can guarantee the workers are paid proper terms and conditions because they're public sector employees, rather than having to rely on building contractors who might be subbing out some of it through forced bogus subcontracting, etc. For me, that's the real value of direct labour. But actually what our local authorities are paying at the moment for the direct delivery of public housing through Part 8 social housing plannings is actually pretty good value for money.
Any more questions? Yeah, we'll take you at the front.
I have a question to Roy and to Owen. Thanks for coming here tonight. And Owen, I hope you do come when you maybe become a minister in the next government. But I'm a member of the Communist Party, and I was reared in County Down. My mother had 12 of us, and my father was a breadman, so we had very little money. And the house we lived in, my father paid a basic income of 10 to 12.5% of his wage as a breadman. And my mother, plus rearing our own children, went out as a cleaner, okay? So we did okay. Now, my question is, this whole housing policy, which no one seems to talk much about or write much about, is all about control, okay? In those days, my father as a shop steward went on strike many different times over workers' conditions and rights. Nowadays, people are afraid to go on strike, and for some reason they don't join a union, but they should, okay? Because it's only through a union where you'll develop workers' rights. The question I want to ask to Owen and Roy, in the comments made by Jimmy Dorn, no relation, what do you disagree with? Thank you.
And do we want to take another one as well? Any others? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I think one of the speakers had mentioned the issue with wages. So you've talked quite a bit about policies that you would like to do to improve the housing. What kind of policies would you pursue to improve wages so people are better able to afford the expensive rents and house prices?
Great, thank you. And I just saw we've one more over here. Oh, sorry, Liz.
Hey, yeah, a lot of good discussion about like policy and politics. I was wondering if we could touch a little bit more on sort of the organising and mobilising aspect. So I think it's like quite important to think about what structural power tenants and working class communities have. And when we're talking about like the water charges movement, the effect of the water charges movement, that was brought about not just by large rallies and demos, but also by direct action in working class communities in ways that directly confronted unjust legislation and so on. So what space do the speakers see for the power of communities and tenants coming together in terms of things like withholding rent, blocking evictions, that sort of thing? And how would they support communities to get organised around that sort of stuff if you actually want to grow the base for a mass housing movement?
Rory, do you want to take the first
Okay.
the first one?
In terms of the question on, you asked me what do I disagree with. I think there's not much. I think that for me, the core of how we solve it is the expansion of, you know, what I think we all agree with, this non-market forms of housing. And I think that can come in lots of different ways. And, you know, I think that for me as well, a core part of it is a state construction company. I do think we actually need not just expanding local authorities' capacity, because, you know, we could debate this over and back, and in some ways, like, you know, it's not really, if you put it into local authorities, great, but I think that there is a real value in creating a state entity like the ESB that would have the capacity, wherever you are in the country, to build affordable homes, be they, you know, for councils, for housing associations, and for sale in you know, a restricted market. But because if we look at it, I think if we learn from how our local authorities operate, part of the issue is expertise isn't built up. And you need expertise in housing and construction. And I think that giving a state company that would be probably a semi-state like the ESB, that would give people the permanent contract, that would give a very clear to all the different trades and sectors within the construction sector. I think if you were aiming to build up a company that had like 10,000 employees who would have the capacity to deliver thousands of homes each year, then you're really guaranteeing a housing supply of public housing into perpetuity. And it wouldn't be dependent on, is this local authority effective, or is this local authority manager into public housing or not? Are these people being moved from collecting road tax to suddenly figuring out how to respond to housing? And I do think part of our problem, why we are in it, is that we haven't valued housing and all the aspects of it within our local authorities. It's treated like just collecting road tax as opposed to the fundamental importance of home. And so I really, really feel that we need a state development and construction company that would provide, and particularly as we look forward what's coming in terms of rising interest rates, economic instability. We will hear the arguments again. We have to cut back on funding, and if Owen is in government, he's going to have all those challenges faced. You don't have money to spend, and this is your limit. And I think that we need to find ways like that to really expand public housing. And I do think that it is about supporting cooperatives. It is about supporting all these different ways we can to develop non-market housing as much as possible. And part of that as well, I think, and it has been mentioned tonight, is I do think we need to restrict the role of real estate investment funds. I think their tax break needs to be removed. I think that they need to be limited, because what's happening is that they are now basically taking over the market. They have reached too far. And if we look what happened in Berlin, they're looking to buy back these units because investment funds are charging such high rents. So I think we need measures that limit their role. And as well then in terms of landlords, I think that, I think we should be reducing our role of private rental. I think we should be aiming for a housing system where people own their home or they have public housing, and private rental plays a very small role. And it is there if people need it, in terms of mobility and that. But really, we should be looking at expanding massively our public and affordable to buy, I think. And in terms of, I think, the question about activism and how we change things, I completely agree. I think that, and Owen set it out, I think that this is not going to change. And even if Owen is elected in government, I think there will still need to be civil society movements and change that, because the change that's needed at so many levels in our state is going to require citizens to become active, in changing how local authorities treat people, in how we as a society look at this. It's going to require a huge value shift in how we see housing and understand it. And I think that there's room for all the forms, and we need it, the activism and citizens to stand up in every way possible in forms of direct action, like Apollo House, like preventing evictions. I do feel, people need to be supported in their homes right now to be, they're being evicted into hidden homelessness. And I think that we have to challenge that idea that it's just okay to evict people into homelessness. It's not and shouldn't be. And so I think that there is a real need. And the other aspect of that, I would ideally see as well, that the generation who need homes are supported into an activism that they are involved in developing their homes too. That we would be putting aside public land for people who want to, and supporting them to self-build, to have cooperatives, to actually be involved in community designing, that it's not just, your house is delivered for you, and particularly in sustainability and climate issues, that people are involved in that. And I think that would be a real, way to get people involved and change it. And we have huge amount of land. That is not our problem. The problem is who owns it and what the state is doing with it. And I think there's a real opportunity to give a whole generation who need homes be involved in designing and developing their homes as well, and co-managing them cooperatively.
Thank you so much. Jimmy, do you want to take the one on direct action?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll take a couple of them there. Guy over there talked about wages. How do you protect wages and stuff? If we went to the system of differential rents, which is 15% of income, the wages that are now considered extremely low because of the exorbitant rents that are being charged is nullified. So it puts like 85% more money back in your pocket. And in your pocket, it goes back into the community. When it's been paid to a landlord in rent, it goes off on a yacht or in some luxurious attribute to that person or group of people. Somebody else mentioned the hospital there, and you know how and it's just another building, basically speaking, a big building, a big house, if you want to call that, for sick people. But that has gone mad as far as the money it's costing has got. The builder that's doing, I think it's called BAMI, maybe it'd be a better name, but its costs have shot up threefold what they were originally. But no other builder will take it on now because BAM put the foundations in. So the answer, the solution to that is the state should have stepped in, like they did by nationalising the banks or taking over the price of hospitals. They should have took over that building company. That's what they should have done. And that would have ruled out the 3 and 4 million and the 5 million and whatever the hell it's costing now. So that's that thing. As far as activism is concerned, with all these private landlords, and you know, some are big, they've 20, 40, 100 houses. Lots of others have 10 or 15 houses. They're multimillionaires if they've 10 or 15 houses. In 2018, 53% of all property sold in Ireland was paid for in cash. You know, and that's the reality. That's who owns the property. You know, it's not you and me. And now, as Rory has said, the vulture funds have come in the last 10 years. The vulture funds would be a good target because they may own a block of apartments with, we say, 200 flats in it. So if everybody would hold a rent, you have power there. But against multiple landlords, you don't. You know, so it's a difficult situation. And if there was universally accessible public housing, as I've been promoting, if there was an issue with the quality of the houses, if there was mould on the walls or leaks in the roof or wires hanging out of the ceilings, then the community could have a rent strike, which has happened in the past. And it actually gives the power to the people that are living in them. But as it stands, the only ones who have power are the ones who own the property. And the ones who own the property, when you have a mortgage, is the banks, and now it's vulture funds and private landlords. So the whole system has to change. They talk about tweaking it here or tweaking it there. There is a proven solution to this. It was done in the 30s, 40s and 50s. Go around every village in Ireland and there's a row of cottages outside the town, council cottages or farm labourer cottages. There's loads of different names they're called by. But that's what we need to go back to. And that's not going back. That's putting into perpetuity, which was the answer to the squalor that we inherited from the Brits. And we need to have confidence in the country, and there's enough in the country for everybody to share. But unfortunately, it's in the hands of a tiny minority at this moment in time.
Thank you so much. And Owen, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Of course, Paul Doran, where's he gone? Has he escaped?
Oh.
Given, Paul, that you know where I live.
Is that threat?
If you're not happy with whatever I do in my future political career, I'm sure I'll get a knock on the door. But the kettle will always be on for you. A couple of things. So, first of all, what do I disagree with Jimmy on? And these are disagreements of, I suppose, of emphasis rather than fundamental disagreements, right? Because I think of the fundamentals we agree. So, first thing, cost rental. The debate has got terribly confused here, partly because the government have confused it. We had cost rental accommodation in this state before we had differential rent. The very, very first public house building programmes of the Free State, Marino, the £1 million project, they were cost rental. The basic principle was they were public homes for working people, and the rents that was charged simply had to pay down the full cost of financing, building and maintaining the property over 60 years. The problem with cost rental as it was initially designed, because we had cost rental from 22 up to 32, and it really took to the end of the 30s before we moved fully to differential rent, is that for working class families that had good skilled jobs, they could afford the cost rents, right? They weren't high rents, and those families could afford them. But if you were a precariously employed or an unskilled labourer, you got into real difficulty. In fact, the very first rent strike we had in the Free State was in Marino, because the folks who couldn't afford the cost rent got into rent arrears. Dublin Corporation at the time was going to try and evict, and there was a rent strike, and it solved some of the problems but didn't end well for all of the folks there. And the only reason I say that is because cost rental can mean different things depending on how you use it. It's a very, very good idea if used properly, and here's the reason why. And this is the other kind of slight difference of opinion I have with Jimmy. Differential rent today only raises enough money to cover half of the cost of the day-to-day management and maintenance of the stock, only half the cost. And it doesn't raise anything towards the long-term structural upkeep, refurbishment, or indeed retrofitting costs that we now have. So differential rent is really, really good for very low income, unemployed and working people. The problem is, however, as you move up the income chain, differential rent becomes an increasingly good deal for you. So, for example, in my local authority, it's 10% in a euro. Dublin City, it's 15%. And for households, whose gross income is anywhere up to kind of 40%, that's about right. But a household whose gross income is on 60%, 60,000 euros or 80,000 euros, 10% is too low a rent for those people. They can have a much, much more affordable level of rent. It wouldn't be anywhere close to market rent. And therefore, the cost rental principle comes in at some point in the income chart where people can actually afford the full cost of financing, managing, maintaining the stock. Not over 25 years, that does make it too expensive, which is why the government's cost rentals are too expensive, but over 60 years. And therefore, I think what we need is to move towards a public housing system that has a mixture of cost rental and differential rental mixed in a way that ensures, one, people have really, really fair rents, but two, that it pays for itself. Because why are Dublin City Council perpetually talking about knocking down some of our inner city apartment blocks? Not because they weren't designed well, not because they weren't built well, because the local authority never had enough money to manage and maintain the stock over the long period of time. And that's a challenge we have to get our heads around. The other thing I disagree with Jimmy on is tenant purchase, because a couple of people have mentioned ownership. Go and talk to council tenants about who owns their property. They don't think they own them, right? In fact, the most common complaint that local authority councillors and TDs get is frustration by local authority tenants who are paying the rent, who feel they've no control over the property at all. In fact, the conditions for making any kind of alterations to your property are very, very onerous. And there's no intergenerational security of tenure. And that's particularly a big issue for families now. That doesn't mean I agree with tenant purchase as it's currently designed, but there are ways of thinking about tenant purchase which enables people to own property, if that is what they want to do, keeps higher income working class families within local authority housing estates rather than feeling that the only option is to buy out of the local authority estate. But crucially, never allowing that property to go into the private market by having covenants on the non-sale of the land. So my preference for tenant purchase is if families want to purchase, they can. They don't get to buy the land. And there's a set of conditions attached by way of covenant for the perpetual use of that land for them and future generations of the family. One is they can't sell the property in the private market. If they want to sell, they sell it back to the local authority at the future discounted price that they benefited from. Two, they can never rent it out in the private rental sector. And I say this as somebody who has a significant amount of experience in issues not just of public housing policy, but of estate management. The best local authority housing estates out there, the ones that everybody wants to live in, are the ones where about half of the folks own the homes. They've tenant purchased them, but they've stayed there, or they've passed the properties on to their kids or their grandkids. That generates a level of income mix and diversity, which is a healthy thing. So I think you can have a version of tenant purchase without the risk of losing the property, subject to having a proper replacement rate. And then the last bit of Jimmy's, which I disagree with, but I only disagree with it now, right? Because I think the end point is the same, is universality. See, if we say today, get rid of the income limits completely, anybody can apply, how do we make sure that those people who have the greatest level of need get it before those people who, for example, like me, who rents in the private rental sector? Yes, I pay a high rent, but I can afford it. And therefore, I think what you have to do is you have to expanding what public housing is accessible for, absolutely. The income limits as they currently stand aren't acceptable. And that you want to move towards a situation where your public housing stock grows so big, it essentially becomes universal. But that's 10, 20 or 30 years away. We have to deal with the 140,000 people who need social housing today, 140,000 households who need social housing today, plus the 5,000 to 10,000 households who come onto the list each year, plus all of those people who simply cannot afford to rent or buy on the market because they're paying 30, 40, 50% of their net take-home pay. And as we've dealt with those people, if we then want to let other folks on higher incomes into the public housing system, that's fine, but that's at a later stage. The other question is then on wages. Obviously, the single most important thing is to strengthen the trade union movement. A mandatory recognition of trade unions in workplaces as a legislative right is absolutely key. There is a direct relationship between trade union membership, trade union mobilisation in the workplace and wages. That's the lesson of history, and government can and needs to legislate for that. We also need to move towards the living wage as opposed to the minimum wage. And in particular, the one thing the state can control is low pay within the public sector and ending the outsourcing of lower grades of public sector workers, whether it's maintenance contractors or cleaners in hospitals, schools and all of those. So those are the kind of things that you would do in the short to medium term. And then organising and mobilising, we need everything. And we need to avoid at the early stages of right to water, we all got ourselves in a little bit of a tizzy because not everybody's going to support everybody else's tactics. But we have to have a movement that has space for everybody's tactics, right? Which means there's going to be folks who want to do direct action. We had Take Back the City, for example, who were doing brilliant work in and around the same time as Raise the Roof was getting up and running. The Housing and Homeless Coalition were doing those things. Housing Rights Now were doing their work. All sorts of other grassroots groups. We need to encourage a flourishing of as many of those different forms and not get hung up if one group or another group does or doesn't agree. We eventually agreed a rule on right to water that every group had the right to do what they wanted outside of right to water, and right to water didn't colonise all of those different expressions, but was the base minimum which allowed everybody to come together and have those big demos. So I agree with the questioner completely. Right to water didn't defeat water charges. Right to water was one crucial element to it. I think it was really necessary because it had that critical mass. But you had all of the campaigns against meters, you had all of the campaigns against charges, you had a proliferation of all sorts of local groups and initiatives, as well as the different activist organisations and political parties. We have to have all of that. But let's respect each other's boundaries and differences. So just because somebody, in one party or in one grouping doesn't support what I want to do, I'll still collaborate and work with them when we come together, because you need to have that. And then finally, two related points. State construction company. One's not enough, folks. One company isn't going to build 20,000 houses a year, right? And I've always been taken by Nye Bevan. Nye Bevan, as I'm sure most of you know, was the Socialist British Labour MP in the Attlee government, who drove through the National Health Service against enormous resistance from his own party, including the Labour right of Ernest Bevan and others. But also against the vested interest in the private sector. But he was also the Minister for Housing. And what was really interesting was he was probably the most important Minister for Housing they had in post-war Britain. He built the largest number of homes of the highest possible quality in a country torn by war. But Nye Bevan understood the difference between a health system and a housing system. A health system had to be nationalised. The economies of scale, the complexities of healthcare back then, let alone now, require an NHS or something like that. I am firmly of the view that housing isn't national. It is regional and local. First of all, the decision should always be made as locally as possible by communities and councils and elected members and others. But also the market itself and the system itself is regional in terms of building contractor skills, workers, etc. So I actually think, rather than thinking about some big company up here, we need a proliferation of different public delivery mechanisms to do these things in different ways. And I actually think that would be more nimble and faster. So it's not an argument against Rory. Rory and I sometimes have this conversation. But it's just, we had a building company. Fianna Fáil had one. They built Ballymun, right? And lots of people say it was a disaster when it was disbanded. But that was no use to people in Kerry or Cork or Waterford, etc. So I think it's more about how many different public levers can we utilise at the lowest level possible to deliver the largest volume of those public non-market homes. And then finally on the funds, because let's get two things right. Best way to deal with the funds is just tax them, because once we end all of those egregious tax reliefs, they're gone. They're not going to stick around if we hit them with tax on the rent roll and tax on capital gains. But let's also not cod ourselves that they are our primary problem outside of anywhere other than inner city Dublin. These funds only hold currently about 5,000 properties. They are colonising inside the canals in Dublin. About 80% of new planning applications are built to rent by the funds. They're a big problem in inner city Dublin. But folks, they're not doing an awful lot outside. Yes, a little bit in the commuter belt. But go to Galway City, Waterford City, Cork City, they're not really interested there. That's not to say that we shouldn't do exactly what Rory said. We should absolutely do that. And we had a private members motion which other parties in the opposition supported. But our primary problem is not the funds right now, much and all as they're causing us great difficulty. Our problem is a government that does not want to invest the volume of direct state investment to build the volume of public homes that we need. That's our biggest problem, and therefore the focus of any campaign, while talking about all of these other issues, has to be about that big prize. How much money do we need the state to invest through whatever is the best non-market public mechanism to deliver the largest volume of public homes? Because that's what's going to make the difference. All of the other things are key, but unless the state is doing, and this is where I agree with Jimmy, what states did previously, which is front-loading direct capital investment in large volumes in social and affordable homes, all of the rest is going to be firefighting. And that's why Rightly Raise the Roof has placed that, along with another core issues like the right to housing, etc., at its centre, because if we want public housing, we need public investment and the maximum level at the fastest possible opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I could come in just a couple of points.
Yeah.
Cost rental model in Marino 100 years ago didn't work, and it was over a 60-year period and didn't work because there was precarious work and people hadn't got good jobs. We're back to that situation again. Yeah. So that's why it doesn't work today either. The differential rents don't pay, they only pay 50% of the cost of maintaining the houses. And that's why that's because all of that work has been subbed out to subcontractors who charge huge rents or huge costs for building work once it's a corporation contract. And we see that all the time. Multiple building companies, you may need multiple building companies, but we don't have multiple transport companies. We have CIE. We don't have multiple electricity supply companies. We have the ESB. So it'll be a state-owned building company, and it may have a branch in Tralee and one in Donegal and one in Cork and one in Dublin. But the whole thing is, and again, I keep going back to it, ownership. Who owns it? The state owns it. And that's the difference. Once the state owns it, the profit figure is taken out of it. It's taken out of the equation. You may bring in small local builders, which is grand as a temporary measure, but they're still making 6 or 8 or 10% profit on it. That could be used to build more houses. So we really, really have to look at this. And as I said, an awful lot of these things, particularly the likes that, I won't swear, Dara O'Brien, they love confusing. They love distracting us. They love muddying the waters and housing for all. I remember I was looking at the last election, and Jim Callaghan came out after the whatever constituency he's in, and the first thing he says, we're gonna have to do better on housing. And he didn't mean build more houses. That's right. He meant he had to get a better message out there to get elected. Right. And that's what all these people are interested in doing. And there is one clear, proven solution to the housing crisis. It's been done before. It can be done again. It was done here. It was done in Britain. And that's public housing for differential rents. And the problem with differentials in the past, and I said there was one major mistake made, that it wasn't universally accessible. If it's universally accessible, higher income families come in. It's not ones that stay on longer, after purchasing their house. We need a complete mix of people where public housing is the normal way of living, is the normal housing situation for everyone. It was normal for lots of people for many, many years. And, the best of families come out of the council estates, and very happy, healthy families and all the rest. And no stress or worrying about the rent or mould growing off the wall or whatever. So we really have to start putting the people first. And to hell with the vulture funds, to hell with the big builders who charge 6%, 10% or 25%. I don't really care how much it is. 1% is too much. So we have to get back to basics and start having a government that runs the country in the interest of people. And I hope Sinn Féin will do that. And I hope that once they're in a situation where they've 37% of the vote or whatever, and they've go into a coalition, that they will stand firm on the issues that are very important. And that's health, housing, education, transport and the environment. So that we can have a decent country to live in. To hell with the best little country to do business in. Let Sinn Féin make this the best little country in the world to live in. And that's my challenge to you, Owen.
Happily take it.
I think that's all we have time for, is it?
No, it's only 8:30.
Do we?
We on the actually left.
You promised not to heckle, Con.
Shut up, Owen, and fuck off. Now that is called heckling, Owen. And to hell was actually Oda Bradcar and the Irish Times and the Sunday Times. I will heckle Owen if you like it or not. No, really. If they plan to call an election within the next 4 years, we as activists on the ground have to be smarter than them. There's a question I always learn. I always ask, did we learn anything from the activism? Did we learn anything from the activism of 2008? No, we have not. No, we have not. We need to go back on the ground, working with actually people in convincing them we can do it better. But we can only do it if we are a united people, a united voice. That enough of this private property bull, enough of the vulture funds and members of Dáil Éireann lining their actually pockets and bowing to these people. If you have no faith in people, if we have no faith in people on the ground, then what the hell are we doing in these rooms?
Here, here.
Are we, is that all the time we have? Yeah, okay, that's going to be the... Huh? Oh, yeah, okay.
Sorry, just a couple of things. Owen mentioned at the beginning something which is very commonly talked about, that a lot of the smaller owners of landlords are leaving the market, but nobody has ever explained why they are doing that at this time when rents are soaringly high. If I could just make one or two other points. I'm an engineer, and when I started, a lot of the time after started work, I was collaborating with an outfit called the National Building Agency, which designed all the housing estates for all the local authorities, and it was a government body, and it worked extremely well. And of course, all the architect firms and quantity surveyors and so forth objected that it was unfair competition. So finally, the government got rid of it, firstly by means of sort of privatizing it or making it a private company and then abolishing it altogether. But there is one other thing, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but there hasn't been a single mention all night about the EU. And unfortunately, all of the things, we are not an independent state anymore. That's a fact. In the 30s, the government could build houses, could decide to use local authorities or wherever to build houses. They can't now. It's illegal. They can't just go and decide to do things because the EU will prevent them. And so I think that has to be put into the mix in the plans that we have for the future. We have to look into the restrictions that the EU places on us.
Can I come back on those?
You can.
Yeah, so three quick things. I'm a strong critic of the European Union. I've campaigned vigorously against the last two treaties, and if the latest agreement in terms of the future consolidation of the federalist project ever ends up as a treaty, I'll campaign against it. But let me be very clear, because I hear the argument that the good friend made at the end sometimes, and it is simply not true. There is nothing stopping an Irish government from investing whatever amount of its money it wants into the delivery of the largest volume of public homes that we need. Nothing. And that's not a defence of the EU. Housing is not a competence of the European Union. In fact, government could be borrowing at very, very competitive rates from the European Investment Bank to deliver large volumes of public housing. And the only reason I'm taking a strong line against you is I don't want anybody to think that this government isn't 100% responsible for the levels of investment and the levels of output. They are. The European Union controls all sorts of other areas, and you've heard Guy Verhofstadt and others campaigning against the last remaining bits of unanimity in terms of the latest agreement. But on housing, it is on the government, and the government could be doing double or even treble if it had the capacity in terms of its investment and output, and people need to be clear about that. Just on the private rental sector, and the left needs an analysis of this, and we shouldn't be scared of having it. Rory made a point at the start, and he's spot on. Our private rental sector is too big. right? It mushroomed following all of the Section 23 tax breaks and the soft lending to individuals to buy a second property during the Celtic Tiger, from a rental sector of about 90,000 units to one now which is just shy of 300,000, right? At its high point, it was almost 20% of our housing system. It's about twice the size it should be. We do need a private rental sector, properly regulated with proper protections for tenants. And in an ideal world, it would probably be about 10% of our housing system. The problem is we have 100,000 households on HAP, RAS and rent supplement in that private rental sector. So if it starts to shrink in an uncontrolled, disorderly way, the collateral damage is the families who are presenting and going into emergency accommodation today. The straight answer to your question, which is why those landlords are selling, there's a portion of those landlords who never wanted to be landlords. They never bought a property to be landlords. They bought a small property during the Celtic Tiger. Their family grew. Property was in negative equity, so they couldn't trade up. So they've ended up renting out their own home and probably renting the home that they're currently living in. They've now got positive equity. House prices are through the roof. They're selling up. That's one group. And we don't know how many they are because government has never bothered trying to calculate it. With respect to those people who did buy a second, in some cases a third, but primarily just a second property with Section 23 tax reliefs and other offerings at the height of the Celtic Tiger, they never bought the property for the rent. They never saw it as an active investment where they would provide a service and they would get money. They saw it as a passive investment where it was the capital gain at the end that would be of benefit to them. Many of them have high Celtic Tiger mortgages, rents dropped, now they've risen. They're just getting out. They didn't understand, and nobody explained to them at the time, being a landlord's a full-time job if you're going to do it properly in terms of the legislation, the rules. And the problem is, as long as house prices continue to rise, more and more of those semi-professional accidental landlords are going to go. And right now, we do not have the public homes to put them into. So, for example, and it might not be popular with everybody in the room, but there's a large volume of those landlords selling up, issuing notices to quit with social housing applicants, HAP, RAS or rent supplement. If the property is at the right price, if it's in the right location, if it meets the needs of the family, and if the property is sound and secure, the state needs to buy that home, right, to stop those families becoming homeless. Otherwise, they're going to end up in emergency accommodation for 2, 3, and in some cases 4 years. Likewise, we have to restrict the ability of buy-to-let landlords issuing vacant possession notices to quit. It's called the Focus Ireland Amendment, because of course they get more if they sell the property vacant, and it's less likely another landlord will buy. So there's a bunch of emergency measures we have to take now because those landlords are going, and at this stage there's probably not a lot that can be done to keep them in the market. The last thing I want to say is this, because I know people are being a little bit flippant about future ministers and future governments, but let me make one recommendation to all of us in the room, and I make it to myself as well. Let's imagine tomorrow we had a left-wing government in this state, only made up of parties of the left, right? However you want to define them, with a really brilliant programme for government, and on, for example, housing. It has the kind of public house building programme that in broad sense we agree with and the kinds of capital investment we want. Let's just imagine that was possible. That government is going to face enormous resistance from a variety of sectors, right? Enormous resistance. And therefore, whoever is in that government and whoever that minister is needs a massively mobilised civil society movement to keep the feet of that minister and that government to the fire to counter those vested interests. And they are the Construction Industry Federation, they're Irish Institutional Property, Property Industry Ireland, but a whole sector of other interested parties. And if you look at left governments that have emerged in Europe over recent decades, although they've been few and far between, one of the mistakes that the progressive social movements make is when the government they want to do, or the government they're hoping is going to do the right thing when they get into government, gets into government, they demobilise. Right? It happened particularly with the first of the 3 left governments in Sweden a bunch of years ago, not so much in Portugal more recently and other places, because they thought their work was done. And what that meant was, even a good minister with a good government doesn't have the popular mobilisation to make it impossible for the other vested sectoral interests to get in the way and stop a progressive programme for government for change. So all I would urge all of us to do is, if we build up this movement, it's not about who gets into government. It's a movement that remains organised and mobilised in all of its diversity until the housing system is changed. Whether that takes 1 government, 2 governments or 3, that's a much bigger and longer term task. But that's the task we all have to face, set ourselves, whether we're in a political party, a social movement, a trade union, housing activist group or whatever. And I would just send out that warning that it's not about having an individual in the Customs House. It's about all of the activism that surrounds that and forces that individual and that government to do what needs to be done to fix our broken housing system. Can it happen? Yes, it absolutely can. But we have to go from meetings like this and build and organise and mobilise so that the things we're talking about and the broad consensus that there is on the core principles don't just be consigned to meetings of left-wing activists and politicians, but become the core of a programme for government and the actions of a government delivering real change on housing in the near future.
Thanks so much. Okay, and we are out of time now. So thank you so much to our panellists this evening, and thank you all for coming. And be sure to check out the rest of the schedule for the James Connolly Fest for the rest of the week. Thank you so much.
Could I just make one little announcement there? Owen was talking about workers' rights. I'm involved in a group called Trade Union Left Forum. Some of you may know about it as well. And we've actually drafted legislation now to replace the rights lost to workers under the 1990 Industrial Relations Act. And it will be launched in Unite Hall on the 2nd of June at 6 o'clock. And there will be prominent speakers at it. So there was a motion passed by the ICTU conference there in October to get these rights back for workers, and the trade union movement has done nothing about it. So the grassroots have done the bill for them, and you're all welcome to attend at 6 o'clock. Middle Abbey Street, Unite, the Union Hall. Okay, see you there. We'd see you there as well, Owen.